The afternoon looked peaceful, but it shattered in seconds. A wealthy white woman made a vicious, fabricated report, and police rushed in on an elderly black grandmother in a wheelchair and her 10-year-old grandson. Without hesitation, the officer pepper-sprayed the child in the face and threw him to the ground, while his grandmother screamed in despair, powerless to protect him. Innocence was turned into suspicion through pure malice and prejudice. What would you have done if you stood there? Would you have stayed silent or spoken out for a black child who could not fight back? We tell these stories to stir hearts and awaken conscience. Share your feelings in the comments. Subscribe if you believe justice matters, and may kindness follow you through this day. Have a good day. The afternoon sun lingered gently over Riverside Square, casting long shadows across the rows of oak trees that bordered the clean stone path. The air was still warm from midday, but there was a faint breeze carrying the smell of roasted nuts from a vendor's cart nearby. People moved leisurely. Children clutched balloons, mothers chatted on benches, and businessmen hurried toward the tram stop. Into this space rolled Clara Johnson, a 60-year-old black woman confined to a wheelchair, her frame small, but her presence dignified, her gray hair cropped close, and her shawl carefully folded across her lap. Beside her walked Ethan, her grandson of 10, his brown eyes bright with innocence, his short black curls bouncing as he carried his school backpack, the straps hanging loosely from his shoulders. They looked like any grandmother and grandson enjoying a slow stroll home, yet the quiet square was about to turn into a place of terror. From a marble bench near the fountain sat Veronica Hale, a wealthy white woman in her early 50s, her blonde hair neatly coiled into a bun, a pearl necklace gleaming against her silk blouse, her manicured nails tapping impatiently on her phone. She had moved into Riverside only months ago, but had already gained a reputation for treating people of color with suspicion, masking prejudice beneath a polished smile. Her pale blue eyes narrowed as she watched Clara and Ethan approach, her lips curling into a faint sneer. To her, their presence disturbed the illusion of exclusivity she believed she had purchased along with her mansion on Maple Drive. With deliberate calm, she raised her phone and dialed the local police, her voice carrying the urgency of a practiced accuser, whispering into the receiver that two suspicious figures, one woman in a wheelchair and a young boy, were loitering dangerously near the children's play area. Her words, though entirely fabricated, dripped with conviction, as though rehearsed. Within minutes, the soft hum of a police cruiser broke the lazy rhythm of the square. Officer Richard Barrett stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, his late 30s frame hardened by years on the force. His hair was clipped short, his jaw square, but what stood out was the coldness in his gray eyes and the stiffness in his gait, a man who carried both authority and resentment in equal measure. Dressed in dark navy uniform, badge glinting under the afternoon sun, his hand instinctively rested near the holster on his hip as he scanned the crowd. Barrett had served 12 years in Oak Ridge Police Department and was known, though never officially charged, for his aggressiveness toward minorities. He spotted Clara and Ethan instantly, the only black faces in the square, and without pause, he strode forward, his boots echoing sharply against the stone pavement. Ethan stiffened at the sight of the officer, his small fingers gripping the strap of his backpack tighter, his body shrinking as though bracing for a blow. Clara, recognizing the danger etched into the officer's expression, reached for Ethan's hand, squeezing gently to remind him to remain calm. "Good afternoon, officer," she said with steady politeness, her voice carrying both strength and tremor, trying to de-escalate before escalation had even begun. Barrett ignored the greeting, his eyes narrowed, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of passers-by. "You there, boy? Stop right now. What are you doing in this area? Show me some identification." Ethan swallowed hard, his voice quivering yet respectful. "Sir, I'm just walking with my grandma." "I'm only 10. I don't have an ID yet." He pointed softly toward Maple Avenue. "We live just 3 blocks away," Clara added. "We've done nothing wrong, officer. We are simply on our way home." Her words, calm and measured, attempted to remind him of their humanity, but Barrett's suspicion only grew sharper. He barked another order. "Open your backpack." "Let me see what you're carrying." Around them, a hush began to spread as parents pulled their children closer, uncertain but curious, some lifting their phones to film. The boy fumbled with the zipper, his hands trembling. Clara leaned forward in her wheelchair, her heart pounding, her voice trembling with urgency. "Officer, please, he's just a child." "There's nothing dangerous in there, only school books." But before Ethan could fully open the bag, his nervous hand shifted toward his pocket where his phone rested. Barrett's eyes flashed. "He's reaching!" he shouted with sudden intensity, his hand darting to his belt. In one fluid, merciless motion, he yanked out his pepper spray and unleashed a burning stream directly into Ethan's eyes. The boy screamed, his small frame collapsing to the ground. Clutching his face as the chemical fire seared through his skin and lungs, Clara shrieked, her voice cracking the stillness of the square. "No, he's just a child." Her trembling hands gripped the wheels of her chair, propelling herself forward with desperate force. Her cries rose above the gathering gasps of onlookers, a sound filled with both anguish and fury. Ethan writhed on the ground, his knees scraping against the pavement, tears mixing with the sting of the spray as he tried to breathe through the choking haze. But as Clara pushed forward, her path was abruptly blocked. Veronica Hale, the very woman who had made the call, stepped deliberately into the wheelchair's path, her polished heels clicking against the stone, her cold smile betraying satisfaction. "Stay back," she hissed. Her hands pressed firmly against the armrests, pinning Clara in place. The officer glanced briefly at Veronica and gave no protest, as though her interference was not only tolerated but expected. Clara struggled, her frail arms pushing against Veronica's grip, but her strength was no match. Tears welled in her eyes as she watched her grandson's small body being forced to the ground, his cries echoing like a knife through her heart. "Please," she begged, her voice raw, "you're hurting him." "He's my baby." Veronica's face remained unmoved, her chin lifted with an air of superiority. "If he has nothing to hide, he has nothing to fear," she said coldly, echoing words used countless times to justify cruelty. Around them, the crowd grew larger, whispers turning into murmurs of unease, yet still many remained frozen, uncertain whether to intervene. Some raised their phones higher, recording every moment, while others turned away, unwilling to face the discomfort of injustice unfolding before them. Barrett twisted Ethan's small arms behind his back, the metal cuffs biting harshly into tender skin. The boy whimpered, his voice breaking between sobs. "Grandma, I didn't do anything. I didn't do anything wrong." Clara's entire body shook as she cried out, her voice breaking under the weight of helplessness. She wanted nothing more than to shield him, to absorb the pain herself. But Veronica's hands pressed down firmly, denying her even the chance to comfort her grandson. It was cruelty compounded by complicity, the abuse of power reinforced by prejudice. Every second stretched like an eternity, each gasp of Ethan's pain echoing in Clara's chest as if it were her own. The square, once filled with idle laughter and the sound of children at play, now hung in heavy silence, pierced only by the cries of a boy and the sobs of his grandmother. The image was unforgettable. A child blinded by pepper spray, a grandmother in a wheelchair restrained not by the law but by the prejudice of another woman, and an officer whose badge became a weapon rather than a shield. It was not just a confrontation, it was a tragedy laid bare in the heart of a public square. And though no one yet knew it, the moment was being etched into memory, recorded by trembling hands and silent witnesses, a spark that would soon ignite the demand for truth. The cries of Ethan still echoed through Riverside Square as the moment stretched into something unreal, a scene that seemed to pull all air from Clara's lungs and leave only the weight of despair. The crowd had begun to murmur louder, but no one stepped forward, no one pried the officer's grip from the small wrists of the boy who whimpered in agony. Clara's body trembled violently, her hands shaking as though struck by cold even beneath the warm sun. She wanted to rise, to push her chair harder, to fight with a strength she no longer had, but every attempt was futile against Veronica Hale's obstruction and the oppressive force of a system determined to see guilt where none existed. The sting of helplessness was sharper than any wound. Her fingers fumbled near the side pocket of her shawl, where her phone was tucked away like a lifeline she had almost forgotten. Clara's eyes were wet with tears, but instinct sharpened her movements. Her mind remembered the one person she trusted beyond family, someone who had promised long ago that if trouble ever came, he would not hesitate to stand at her side. Jack Miller, a man in his mid-40s, once a U.S. Army sergeant who carried the heaviness of distant wars and the scars across his forearms, now working as a mechanic not far from Riverside. Their friendship had been forged years before when Jack helped repair Clara's small grocery after a storm had shattered its roof, and since then he had been like a guardian spirit, gruff but reliable. With shaking hands, Clara dialed his number, pressing the phone to her ear, her breath uneven, her words barely coherent as she whispered through sobs. "Jack, it's Clara. They're hurting him. Please, come, hurry." Not far away, leaning against the railing of a shaded balcony overlooking the square, stood a woman whose presence was hardly noticed amid the commotion. Her name was Isabella Morales, 32 years old, a Latin woman of medium build with olive-toned skin, long dark hair tied back in a simple braid, and eyes that carried the fatigue of someone who had lived years balancing caution and survival. Dressed in a plain denim jacket and faded jeans, she looked like any ordinary passerby, yet her phone was raised high, recording every second of the brutal encounter unfolding before her. Isabella worked part-time cleaning offices in the city and sold homemade pastries on weekends to help her mother and younger siblings. She had lived long enough in affluent neighborhoods to recognize the sharp edge of prejudice, had seen Veronica Hale's disdain for Black and Latin families more than once, yet fear of losing her fragile stability had always kept her silent. Now her hands quivered as she continued filming, the red dot of recording burning like a pulse of conscience she could no longer ignore. Though she had not yet gathered the courage to share what she captured with the world, her gaze revealed a quiet determination. This proof would not vanish. The muscles in her jaw tightened as she whispered softly in Spanish to herself, "Que nadie lo borre, no esta vez." Let no one erase it, not this time. Her hesitation was not cowardice, but calculation. She knew the cost of exposing the powerful, yet she also knew she held the key to truth. Down on the pavement, Barrett yanked Ethan upright, his face still drenched in tears and pepper spray, his small chest heaving with ragged gasps. The cuffs cut into his skin as the officer dragged him toward the cruiser, the child stumbling with each step, his vision blurred, his voice hoarse as he repeated, "I didn't do anything. Please, Grandma." Clara reached out her trembling hand, her cries desperate and unrestrained. "Ethan, baby, I'm here. Hold on." But the distance widened cruelly with every stride Barrett took, and Clara's chair rolled forward only to be shoved back again by Veronica's deliberate stance. Veronica's smile flickered with triumph, as though witnessing exactly the outcome she had intended when she made the malicious call. Clara's phone nearly slipped from her grasp as she tried to clutch it tighter, her knuckles white, her voice still breaking through the line to Jack. On the other end, Jack's deep, steady tone cut through the chaos. "Clara, listen to me. Stay calm. I'm coming. Where are you?" His words were like a rope thrown to someone drowning, pulling Clara back from the edge of collapse. She stammered out the location, her words choked with sobs. Jack's silence afterward was not hesitation but fury-controlled, the sound of an engine roaring to life already audible as he ended the call. Clara closed her eyes for a brief second, clutching the phone to her chest, whispering, "Please, Lord, let him get here in time." Meanwhile, Isabella lowered her phone slightly, scanning the faces in the crowd. Some parents had pulled their children away, whispering to leave before things got worse. Others remained fixed, recording but unmoving, their eyes filled with unease, but their bodies unwilling to intervene. Isabella felt the sting of her own fear pressing hard, the fear of retaliation, of losing the little she had if she exposed the truth. Yet when her gaze returned to the boy being forced into the back of the cruiser, she felt something shift inside. The injustice was too raw, too visible. Though her thumb hovered over the share option, she stopped herself, saving the recording instead, her decision clear. Not now, but soon, the world would see. The officer slammed the car door, the sound reverberating through Clara's chest like a closing coffin lid. Ethan's cries were muffled now, trapped inside, and Clara's own sobs tore from her throat, raw and unfiltered. She shook violently in her chair, her frail arms pushing against Veronica's grip, but she could not break free. Around her, people murmured uneasily, some whispering, "It's just a kid," while others muttered support for the officer, poisoned by the same prejudice that had fueled the call. Clara's heart broke not only for Ethan, but for the silence of those who chose safety over humanity. As Barrett returned to the driver's seat, his face stony, Clara's strength seemed to drain away. She collapsed back against her chair, her breath ragged, her tears unending. Her mind screamed with the memory of Ethan's voice, the terror in his words, the sight of his small frame bent under the weight of authority. She felt the cruel truth pressing in. She could not protect him, not in that moment, not against the wall of power arrayed against them. Yet within that despair flickered the faint light of hope, fragile but persistent. Jack was coming, and Isabella had captured everything. The cruiser's engine growled, pulling slowly away from the square, and Clara's eyes followed until it was only a blur. Her hand pressed against her chest, as if to hold her breaking heart in place. Veronica finally released her grip on the wheelchair, satisfied with the outcome, brushing invisible dust from her silk sleeve as though the encounter had dirtied her. Clara turned her head upward, her eyes fierce even through tears, meeting Veronica's with a look that promised this story was not over. Veronica smirked faintly, but Clara's silence carried more weight than words. The square began to return to its uneasy rhythm, the crowd dispersing in fragments, yet the air was heavy with the memory of what had just unfolded. Clara sat alone for a moment, her phone still in her lap, the faint sound of traffic in the distance, her body shaking from exhaustion. Isabella, hidden still among the onlookers, lowered her phone, her expression conflicted yet resolute. She whispered again under her breath, "Not this time. They won't bury this truth." The recording, safe in her hands, waited like a sealed promise. Clara whispered Ethan's name one last time, her voice trembling into the fading noise of the square, her hands clutching the wheels of her chair. She could do nothing but wait, her only strength resting on the knowledge that she had reached out to Jack, and that somewhere nearby, a woman she did not yet know held silent proof of the cruelty inflicted upon her grandson. For the moment, despair reigned, but deep within, the seeds of resistance had been sown. The square still carried the heavy silence of what had just unfolded, the image of Ethan locked inside the cruiser pressing like a weight upon every heart that lingered nearby. Clara trembled in her wheelchair, her sobs soft but unending, her hands gripping the phone she had nearly dropped in despair. Barrett sat in the driver's seat, his jaw set, his fingers tightening on the wheel as if ready to drive away, yet the murmurs of the crowd kept him paused. Into this atmosphere of unease came the sudden roar of a motorcycle engine, louder and sharper than anything else in the square. Its growl cut through the air like the first roll of thunder before a storm, and heads turned instinctively toward the source. Jack Miller arrived with a speed born of fury and determination, his black Harley gliding to a stop at the curb, chrome flashing under the waning afternoon sun. He swung off the bike, his boots striking the pavement with force, his tall frame filling the space with an aura of unshakable strength. At 46, his years of military service were written in the scars along his arms, in the firm set of his shoulders, and in the hardened but steady gaze of his blue eyes. His beard was trimmed short, his hair slightly unkempt beneath a worn leather jacket, the American flag patch on his sleeve faded but visible. Jack was not a man who sought conflict, but when injustice flared, his temper was like dry tinder ready to ignite. His eyes immediately fell on Clara, still trembling in her chair, her face streaked with tears, and then to the cruiser where Ethan's small figure sat hunched in the back seat, his wrists bound in cuffs far too large. The sight ignited a blaze in Jack's chest. He stepped forward without hesitation, planting himself squarely in front of the driver's side door, his broad shoulders blocking Barrett's path. His voice, low but powerful, carried across the square. "Get out of that car, officer. Now, you're not taking that boy anywhere." The tone was not a plea but a command, the kind honed on battlefields where hesitation meant death. Barrett stiffened, his gray eyes narrowing with a flash of irritation at the interruption. He opened the door slowly, stepping out to confront the man now standing like an immovable wall. "Step aside, sir," Barrett said, his voice clipped, carrying the authority of the badge pinned to his chest. "This is police business." Jack's reply was immediate, his voice sharp enough to cut stone. "Police business is not assaulting a 10-year-old child. You pepper sprayed him, threw him down, and shackled him like a criminal. That's not law. That's abuse." The tension rippled visibly through the crowd, some gasping, others murmuring approval at Jack's audacity. Clara, summoning every ounce of her strength, pushed her chair forward despite her trembling hands. Her voice cracked but firm. She called out, "He's my grandson, my Ethan." "You can't take him away. He did nothing wrong." Her wheelchair rolled until she was beside Jack, her presence small in size but immense in spirit, the two of them now standing, one with frailty, the other with force united against the uniformed officer. The air thickened with the clash of power and defiance. On the edge of the square, Isabella Morales had not stopped filming. Her phone trembled slightly in her grip, but her eyes were focused, her lips pressed into a thin line as she captured every second of the standoff. The lens recorded the desperation in Clara's face, the fury etched into Jack's stance, and the cold detachment of Barrett as he confronted them. To Isabella, the moment crystallized the truth. This was no longer just about one child or one family. It was about the raw injustice made visible to anyone willing to see. Her recording was not yet public, but it was alive, a silent witness waiting to speak when she finally dared to share it. Barrett's jaw clenched tighter as he squared off against Jack. He was used to compliance, to people shrinking under the weight of his badge, not to a man who met his glare with unflinching steadiness. "I received a call about suspicious behavior," Barrett insisted, his tone hardening. The boy made a threatening move. Protocol was followed. Jack's laugh was bitter, humorless. "Protocol? I've been in combat zones and I've seen men justify horrors with the word protocol. Don't hide behind it now. Look at him." He pointed toward the back of the cruiser, where Ethan's face, streaked with tears and pepper spray, was visible through the glass. "That's a child, officer. And you'll answer for what you did." Clara's voice rose again, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair, her body shaking with fury. "You hurt my grandson in front of all these people, and you dare call it protection? He was walking home with me." "That's all," her words struck a chord, pulling murmurs of agreement from some in the crowd, their courage inching closer to the surface. For the first time, Barrett's confidence wavered, the weight of growing attention pressing against him. His glance darted briefly toward Veronica Hale, who stood farther back, her arms crossed, her expression smug yet faltering as more eyes turned her way. Jack stepped closer, the distance between him and Barrett now only inches. His voice dropped, steady but deadly calm. "Release the boy. Right here, right now, or you'll find yourself facing more than an angry veteran. You'll face every eye watching, every camera recording, and every truth you've tried to bury." His words carried the force of inevitability, the kind that could not be ignored. Clara, though frail, raised her chin proudly beside him, her voice breaking but resolute. "We will not be silent." Not anymore. The square had shifted. What began as a moment of despair had turned into defiance. The sight of a grandmother and her old friend standing together against abuse of power, pulling others into a current they could not deny. Isabella steadied her phone, whispering to herself that soon the world would see. Barrett stood tense, caught between authority and exposure, his next move uncertain as the air around them tightened with suspense. The moment hovered on the edge of escalation, every heartbeat echoing louder, every gaze fixed on the fragile balance between oppression and resistance. The cruiser idled quietly, its hum a cruel reminder of the boy still locked inside, yet the crowd no longer looked only at the car. They looked at Clara and Jack, at the frail woman in the wheelchair, and the battle-hardened veteran standing tall beside her. From despair, a spark of resistance had been lit, and its glow began to chase away the shadow of helplessness. The fight for Ethan had only just begun, but the power of voices raised against injustice was already changing the air itself. The ride to the station was heavy with tension, the hum of the cruiser engine echoing in Clara's ears like a drumbeat of dread. Ethan was somewhere inside, out of her reach, and though Jack had managed to keep Barrett from driving off immediately, the officer eventually forced his authority with the arrival of backup units. Now, Clara sat in her wheelchair near the entrance of the Oak Ridge Police Department, Jack beside her, his jaw set hard, his fists clenched at his sides. The fading light of evening cast long shadows across the red brick building, its American flag swaying idly as if mocking the ideals of justice proclaimed beneath it. To Clara, every step toward the station felt like entering the lion's den. Inside the fluorescent-lit lobby, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper. The walls bore plaques of commendations and portraits of officers past, nearly all of them white men in uniformed pride. Behind the front desk, Sergeant Harris, a man in his 50s with thinning hair and a belly that stretched his belt, barely looked up as Clara and Jack entered. His eyes flicked over them with impatience before settling on a stack of paperwork. "State your business," he said flatly, though he already knew. Jack stepped forward, his voice deep and steady. "We're here for the boy you assaulted in Riverside Square. His name is Ethan Johnson. He's 10 years old. You're holding him against the law." Clara's voice cracked but remained firm as she added, "He's my grandson. I want to see him now." Moments later, Barrett appeared from a side corridor, his uniform still crisp, his expression smug, as though nothing had been out of order. He was joined by Captain Thomas Reynolds, a tall man in his early 50s, hair silvered at the temples, his polished shoes clicking sharply on the floor. Reynolds carried himself with the confidence of authority, his voice smooth and measured, practiced from years of sidestepping accountability. "Mrs. Johnson, Mr. Miller," he began, offering a shallow smile. "I understand you're upset," but Officer Barrett was responding to a citizen's call. The boy resisted and made threatening movements. Protocol was followed. No laws were broken here. His tone implied closure, as if the matter had already been decided. Jack took a step closer, his towering frame casting a shadow across Barrett. "You call pepper spraying a 10-year-old following protocol? You call twisting his arms until he screamed protection? Don't talk to me about procedure. I've seen procedure twisted to justify war crimes overseas, and I see it being twisted here." Clara's hands gripped the armrests of her wheelchair, her voice shaking but fierce. "You can dress it in words, Captain, but you know the truth. He's a child. My child. You can't bury what you did today." Reynolds' smile faltered for an instant, but he quickly smoothed it, leaning on his desk as if to reassert dominance. In a corner of the room, unnoticed by many, Isabella Morales had slipped inside. She stood quietly against the wall, her denim jacket blending into the shadows, her phone clutched tight in her hand. Her heart pounded as she listened to the exchange, her eyes flicking between Clara's trembling figure, Jack's unyielding stance, and Barrett's smug indifference. She had recorded it all, the pepper spray, the cries, the humiliation, and now the weight of her choice pressed upon her. For years she had kept her head down, fearing the consequences of speaking out, but watching Clara's courage cracked something inside her. With a deep breath, she unlocked her phone, opened her social media app, and pressed post. The video, unfiltered and raw, showed Ethan's small frame collapsing under the blast of pepper spray, Clara screaming as Veronica blocked her wheelchair, Barrett's voice barking accusations. Within minutes, notifications began to flood Isabella's screen. Comments appeared almost instantly: outrage, disbelief, heartbreak. The footage spread from one account to another, multiplied by the hands of those who recognized injustice when they saw it. By the time she slipped her phone back into her pocket, the tide of truth had already begun to swell. Back in the station, Reynolds leaned closer to Clara, lowering his voice as if confiding. "Mrs. Johnson, these things are complicated. Perhaps it's better for your family if this doesn't go public. We can file a simple report, make sure your grandson is released with no further trouble." The words dripped with false sympathy, an offer designed not to heal but to silence. Clara lifted her chin, her tears still streaking her cheeks, but her eyes fierce. "You want me quiet because you know what you did was wrong. But I will not be quiet. Not anymore." Jack's hand rested firmly on the back of her chair, his presence solid as a wall. Barrett snorted, his confidence rattled but still clinging to arrogance. "People will believe the badge over your word any day." But even as he spoke, the faint sound of a phone buzzing filled the room. Then another, and another. Officers at desks glanced at their screens, their brows furrowing, their murmurs rising. A young officer whispered something urgently to Reynolds, who stiffened, his eyes flicking toward Barrett. The video was already circulating, racing faster than they could contain. The captain's face drained of color as realization set in. Control of the narrative was slipping from their hands. Clara sensed the shift, the way the room's air seemed to thicken with unease. For the first time since the nightmare began, she felt the weight lift slightly from her chest. Her voice, though weary, carried strength. "The truth is out there now. You can't hide it. You can't twist it. People will see what you did to him." Jack's glare bore into Barrett, his words cutting. "Your wall of power won't hold. Not this time." Barrett's smirk faded completely, the cold certainty in his eyes replaced with the flicker of doubt. Reynolds turned toward the desk, his hands gripping the edge tightly, but he offered no reply. Outside, the sound of voices began to rise, small groups gathering, some holding up phones, others whispering the boy's name they had already read online. The Oak Ridge Police Department, once a fortress of authority, now trembled under the weight of a community beginning to awaken. Inside, Clara sat straighter in her chair. Jack stood firmly beside her, and Isabella, unnoticed still, pressed her phone to her chest, knowing she had done what fear had denied her for too long. The truth had escaped the station's walls, and no uniform, no badge, no speech could lock it away again. The night had been long for the city of Oak Ridge, its streets buzzing with protest chants, news vans, and the hum of conversations that carried from one household to another. By morning, headlines blazed across television screens and smartphones. Officer Barrett suspended pending investigation. The once proud police department, long shielded by silence, now stood under scrutiny as public outrage rippled through every corner of the community. Statements poured in from local leaders, civil rights organizations, and ordinary citizens who could no longer ignore what they had seen with their own eyes. Justice had not yet fully arrived, but for the first time in years, people dared to believe it might. Inside Clara Johnson's modest home, the atmosphere was both heavy and hopeful. Clara, 60 years old, frail yet strong in spirit, sat in her wheelchair by the window, watching as neighbors left flowers on her front steps. Ethan, bandages still faintly visible on his wrists, leaned against her armrest, his young face tired but bright with resilience. The boy had endured humiliation, pain, and fear, yet his eyes shone with something greater, a determination that belied his 10 years. Jack Miller, leaning silently against the doorway, kept watch like a sentinel, his leather jacket draped across a chair, his face softening for once as he witnessed the bond between grandmother and grandson. The pressure on city officials had become unbearable. Captain Reynolds, who had tried to contain the scandal, now faced his own reckoning as investigations revealed patterns of abuse ignored for too long. At City Hall, Mayor Franklin, a stocky man in his 60s with salt and pepper hair and a perpetually worried brow, stood at a podium before cameras. His suit seemed too stiff, his voice too rehearsed as he admitted, "The events at Riverside Square were unacceptable. Effective immediately, Officer Richard Barrett is suspended without pay, and we will be initiating comprehensive reforms of the Oak Ridge Police Department." The words, though carefully chosen, still cracked open a promise of accountability. Crowds outside cheered, their signs lifted higher, "Justice for Ethan." No more silence. The news traveled quickly to Clara's home. Ethan looked up at his grandmother, a small smile breaking across his face for the first time since that dreadful afternoon. "They listened, Grandma," he whispered. Clara reached out her trembling hand, cupping his cheek, her voice soft but firm. "They had no choice." The truth was louder than their lies. Jack placed a steady hand on Ethan's shoulder, adding gruffly, "This fight isn't over, but you both showed the world that standing tall matters, even when you're sitting in a chair." His eyes met Clara's, and though few words passed, the bond of trust between them deepened. That afternoon, the community gathered at Riverside Square, the very place where despair had first unfolded. The air was alive with movement, children playing freely where once silence had fallen, neighbors hugging one another, strangers clasping hands in shared solidarity. At the heart of the crowd, Clara and Ethan returned. Clara's wheelchair rolled slowly across the cobblestones, her grandson walking beside her, his hand firmly gripping hers. Murmurs spread as people turned, some applauding softly, others calling their names with respect. They had become more than victims. They were symbols of endurance, reminders that resilience could spark change. Among the crowd was Isabella Morales. For days, she had lived with fear that her decision to post the video would bring retaliation, that the powerful might find ways to silence her, as they had silenced so many before. But when she walked into the square that day, she was met with embraces, kind words, and gratitude from faces both familiar and new. A neighbor pressed her hand, saying, "You gave us the truth." Another whispered, "You were brave for all of us." Isabella's eyes filled with tears she had long held back. She stood taller, her fear melting into pride, no longer just an invisible worker in the shadows, but a woman recognized for her courage. Clara extended her hand toward Isabella, her voice carrying enough strength to cut through the crowd. You showed the world what I could not. Thank you. Isabella took her hand gently, shaking her head. No, Signora, thank you. You taught me that silence helps no one. Around them, phones flashed, capturing the moment of solidarity between two women who had lived under prejudice in different ways, their unity now immortalized in the collective memory of the community. As the gathering swelled, Ethan stood before the crowd, his small figure brave and steady. He lifted Clara's hand in his, holding it high as though it were a banner of triumph. His voice, though young, rang clear. We didn't stay silent. The words struck the air like a bell, drawing cheers and tears alike. Clara's heart swelled with pride, her tears this time not of grief but of release. She pulled Ethan close, pressing her cheek against his hair, whispering softly, You are my strength, Ethan. And today, we both found our voices. Jack remained nearby, his posture protective, but even his stern face softened as he looked out over the crowd. He had seen war tear nations apart, had seen men fall for causes no one remembered. But here, in this square, he saw something different. People united not by fear, but by a shared belief that justice was worth fighting for. It was a fight without weapons, yet more powerful than any he had waged before. As the sun dipped lower, the square filled with song voices lifting in unison, a hymn of hope improvised by those who had suffered too long in silence. Children laughed, elders wept quietly, strangers clasped each other's hands, and for one shimmering moment, Oak Ridge felt transformed. The walls of power had cracked, and though much work lay ahead, dawn had broken, promising a future brighter than the darkness that had preceded it. Clara leaned into Ethan's side, her eyes lifted toward the sky painted in hues of gold and rose, whispering to herself, This is only the beginning, but we have shown them justice lives in us all. This story is a reminder that the world changes not only through leaders or laws, but through ordinary people who dare to rise above social prejudice, who extend kindness even when it costs them, and who silently sacrifice for the sake of others. Clara and Ethan, joined by those who stood at their side, showed that courage does not always come with strength or power. It comes from the heart that refuses to remain silent in the face of injustice. Their voices, their tears, and their resilience became a light for an entire community, proving that dignity and justice are worth defending no matter how high the walls of power may seem. If this story touched you, I invite you to share it so that others may reflect, leave a comment with your thoughts to keep the conversation alive, and subscribe to this channel so that more stories of compassion and resilience can continue to be told. May God bless you and your family for standing with truth, for choosing kindness, and for carrying hope into a world that desperately needs it.